Hey there, folks. Before we get started today, I just wanted to take a moment to highlight one of my favorite shows, David Naiman's Between the Covers. Between the Covers features some of the most in-depth, intelligent, insightful literary conversations I've ever heard with writers like Lydia Yuknovich, Garth Greenwell, Zadie Smith, N.K. Jemisin, and Jenny Ofel, just to name a few. And it's one of the few shows that I never skip an episode of. Recently, due to the pandemic, David has had to close down his day job and is now going full-time as a literary host. So if you love literature and top-notch interviews, and you have the ability to donate even $1 per episode, consider making a pledge to David's Patreon campaign at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. I've been a patron of David's for a couple of years now, and it's great to get the bonus audio and extra show notes. More than that, I just love supporting a show as great as Between the Covers. So once again, check out the show wherever you get your podcasts and go check out David's Patreon campaign at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Thanks and enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 114. Today's guest is Jessica Eaton. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show. Today on the show, I'm talking with photographer Jessica Eaton. Jessica Eaton received her BFA in photography from the Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver. She has had solo exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Cleveland, the California Museum of Photography in Riverside, and the Photographers Gallery in London, to name a few. And her work is in the permanent collections of the National Gallery of Canada, Ottawa, the Musée d'Art Contemporain de Montreal, the Art Gallery of Ontario, Toronto, and the Museum of Fine Arts, St. Petersburg, Florida, among others. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship awarded in 2019, and she lives and works in Montreal. Now, I've been following Jessica Eaton's work for a while now. I think I first saw it in 2012 or 2013, her series Cubes for Albers and Lewitt. This series, which she has been working on for about 10 years now, off and on, has evolved over time. But what they are is using multiple exposures to explore additive color. This idea that all of the colors the human eye can see can be created by combining three primary colors of light, red, green, and blue. In the most recent iteration of the series, what she does is photograph boxes that are painted different shades of gray and then uses strobes and color filters exposing the same piece of film over and over again with different filter combinations to construct colors. The final images are simple, but just gorgeous. The process is a little difficult to visualize with just words, so I want to direct your attention to a short documentary that I've linked in the show notes, which is called That Is Picture, in which you can actually see how she works. It's really impressive, and particularly so for me because my photographic process is so different. I've also included links to two of the galleries that represent her, M&B Gallery in LA and Higher Pictures Gallery in New York, where you can see examples of her work. If you're not familiar with Jessica's work, then I highly recommend pausing the episode and checking those out first. All right, then, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Jessica Eaton. I think the first thing that I wanted to talk about is, so your series, Cubes for Albers and Lewitt, I mean, you've been working on that now for quite a long time, like more than a decade, right?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, not solidly that entire time. I kind of have left it for a year or two and then come back, but yes.
Yeah. So the thing that comes up for me when I'm thinking about a long-term project like that, and especially one like yours, is the word iteration.
Mm-hmm.
The project has iterated in a number of ways, obviously. So there's the first way in which, like, the individual pieces have long stretches of they're a similar concept, but, you know, iterated in color, in composition, and things like that. But then also throughout the lifespan of the project, you've iterated what types of images and what kinds of compositions you've been using throughout. So I'm really fascinated by this idea of iteration, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what is enabled by this iteration, and what is it that keeps you coming back to this over and over again for such a long period of time? What do you feel is enabled by that in the work?
Well, for me, the project is almost two separate projects, although using essentially the same parameters. But the first half where I was allowing myself to explore formal possibilities. And so those shift all over the place. And that's actually something I want to come back to. But the underlying thing was the additive mixing of color. And so I took a bit of a pause and did some other projects and then came back to it. And a huge part of that was that I knew I hadn't got to where I thought was possible in terms of the color mixing. I knew there was more there. So it almost feels like a separate project when I returned, which is when I took out the formal explorations, the compositional ones. So for the last 3 years that I was working on those, I switched to a sort of depth box and stuck to the exact same formal composition, and that way was only really working through the color mixing.
I like this idea. I know that this is something that a lot of different artists working in different mediums and art forms find useful and generative, is this idea of working within constraints. And it is interesting to hear you mention how much more constrained the second half of the project is. Do you find that that is something that opens up a lot of possibilities for you? Because you're working at such so much tighter parameters for the second half of this series.
Yeah. And funnily, at the beginning, they were tight parameters. So it was, much, much more so. I had real revelations in terms of how to work with color filters in the second half, because that's really all that was left. And I got much, much, much deeper into sort of the formulas and the logic behind it. And through that, the nature of the medium, essentially, there's vast technical differences from sort of the first images of that project and the second one in terms of how my actual film looks and what I was able to achieve that came out of really eliminating everything but the one aspect. But yeah, restraints. What can come out of limitless possibility? You need parameters to be able to work, I think, in all cases. So it's just a question of how many you want to impose on yourself. And sometimes they're, imposed on you. If you're not imposing them on yourself, they're going to be imposed by the medium itself or the tools you're using or time, space, these sorts of things.
Yeah, it is interesting because I think a lot of people can find it it's sort of like the way people talk about going to the grocery store and you go to the bread aisle and there's 50 different brands of bread, and that having so much choice can be a little overwhelming to the point where you don't know what to do at all. Maybe having fewer options, even if that's something that you've imposed on yourself, could be something that winds up being a little bit freeing. I don't know how that strikes you.
Yeah, a friend of mine told me that my practice was the create a problem, solve a problem approach to art making. And no pun intended, it's sort of put yourself in a box and try and fight your way out of it, I guess.
Yeah. It's actually just reminds me, recently I was talking to another podcaster who, obviously this is a completely different medium, but he works in poetry a lot, and he likes to do things like, for example, try to write a poem that only uses one vowel. You're only allowed to use all E's, and he was saying that by making the process of the poetry, of the writing so difficult, that it forces you to go deeper in order to figure out how to do it. And that process winds up being really revelatory oftentimes.
Yes.
Does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially for the second half. I can look through, when I went to repeated compositional strategy, and I can look at my notes and how they evolve over the 3 years I was doing that. And it's wild how much more precise and detailed and specific it gets. Yeah, I can even tell you it's probably more meaningful to me, but the real thing I came to in that, and I had an experience recently where I'd licensed some of the earlier images for use. And so I was revisiting the files, and these were from the first 2 years I'd been making pictures in this way or within this project. And I couldn't believe how bad my scans were in terms of the information that was there. versus what I was doing now. And to look at them separated by 8 years after having not really revisited the raw scans of those just blew my mind. So I guess the biggest thing is when I first started, if I wanted a red, I would use just a red filter. And if I wanted a cyan, I would use, these really specific, a mixture of just blue and green. What I came to in the second part is that every color has some of all three primaries in it. And that has made so much difference. It's unbelievable. So if I want a red, there is actually still a tiny, tiny bit of blue and green added in there. And the effect of that is that, first of all, my E6, I always want to call them negs, no matter what they are, but they're actually slides. Yeah. It's just my negs, but they're positives. Has so much more depth. So there's like all this stuff around that. Like, why use all three? Well, number one, if you're taking a quote unquote normal photograph and you're dealing with visible light, you're not working with a filter that is cutting off everything except for information, in the like whatever red is 700 nanometers wavelength. You would always have some information coming in that's penetrating your film, because your film is mimicking, right? Your film has a red, green, and blue filter essentially in a color film emulsion that's letting those wavelengths pass. So there's always some seepage. So if you look at a scan taken from reality and it's got tons of red objects in it, when you look at that scan and you look in your channels in Photoshop, you're still going to see information in your blue and green channel. There's going to be less of it. It's going to mostly be in the red channel, but you're still having some, because of course, visible light, we're not ever isolating out that specifically the wavelengths. So what was happening in my earlier works is there was like a flatness that sort of drove me nuts. That was sort of unphotographic, maybe even in a sense, that just isn't there in the later works. I was literally losing an aspect of depth, if you want to think about it that way.
I do always think it's interesting to revisit older work in that way and see how much things have changed over time. It's really fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating and painful. To me now, I'm like, oh, these are terrible. Like they've all sold. Like this is no good. But, but I guess, that's the thing, right? I've always kind of thought with the shows of these, they're like works that I edition. They're like the best of where I'm at, they're never like, there's always this possibility of it being more as you go on. So I guess that's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah. I always like to, I try to mitigate my, my feelings of embarrassment over my previously work that feels unskillful to me now. I try to take that as a sign that at least I've grown in my capacities.
You've improved, right. And it's also like, for me to say something is terrible to anyone who owns my earlier work is very different than, it's not an accurate judgment that it is terrible. At the time, I thought it was wonderful. And to anyone else, it's fine. It's comparatively, it's just so not where I am anymore. And the fact of the matter is things change within yourself, but to somebody else, they're approaching it as this like final flat object without any of the baggage of having to have thought through the problem of its creation.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting, no matter what I've ever worked on, whether it be audio or photography or writing or really anything, I've done some work with video and things like that. When I'm done with a piece, well, first of all, I never actually feel like I'm done. I just sort of stop working on it because I have to. Right. And then, immediately after I'm done with a piece, I always hate it. Like the only thing I can see in it is the things that I wasn't able to do the way I wanted to do. But then if I come back to it, maybe a couple of years later, after I've had a little bit of distance, it's only then that I'm actually able to see the things that maybe other people were going to focus on and what makes the work good. But then of course there's the thing that you're saying about like also, I can see the distance from where my technique is now. So that's,
yeah. Yeah, I think it's normal to go through a full cycle of feelings and thoughts and emotions about things that you've made, right? Mm-hmm. I think everyone experiences that. Yeah. If you don't, you're probably doing something wrong or like not properly invested in the process or the output.
Yeah, I always like to think of it as like my reach always just a little bit exceeds my grasp. And so that's what keeps me going.
Yes, absolutely. But if you thought something you did was the be all end all greatest, what point is there to continue on, right?
Right. Something that I wanted to talk about a little bit is so you did an interview with Luminous Landscape last year, and one of the things that you talked about in that interview was not being interested in indexing reality, and you said that rather you wanted to negotiate the camera to see things you didn't already know. And I thought that was really interesting so like in a couple of different ways, because your practice is a little different from, I think, what the typical photographer, certainly the layperson, and even, a lot of professional and fine art photographers, in that your process involves creating the image in camera, but the image that you're resulting with is something that is constructed and can only be experienced through the final slide or print, right? But this idea of using the camera to see things that you didn't know, what I kind of wanted to explore a little bit about this is, to what extent is your practice about construction, and to what extent it is about discovery, if that distinction makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe more about the tension between the two. In terms of sort of setting up the parameters of any given project and the technical, you kind of do that, and then it becomes a kind of negotiation with the forces that you have to work with, and like time, space, and contingency in these things. So to me, I've always felt best when I've set things up where I feel a little bit like a conduit for something else to happen. So there's like an idea of a picture that I'm sort of striving to, but I always try to leave a really like a swing tavern door open for other things to come back to me. And I try also often to have those things sort of happen and let them sort of redirect maybe the whole project.
I've seen, there was a video that, like a short doc about your process that was really interesting. And one of the things that I found really interesting about it was how finely critical you are of each individual piece, that when you're constructing it, so you have these really, really detailed notes of how you're going to construct the image. But then when you're going through and sort of proofing the slides, like just these tiny little details are enough to say, no, not that one. Yes, this one. And, sort of coming back to this question of iteration, like it seems like your process involves iteration on the individual image level as well. But I like, is it experimental in this way, or because your notes are so tightly and detailed and that like there's a lot of planning involved there too, right?
Mm-hmm. But they're also impossible, I'm going to go with, to carry out I don't know if I've ever executed one 100% to the notes, because often I'm working with an assistant, something gets bumped, something forgets to get pulled. Like we're talking about up to, sometimes it's 90 exposures. Lights are powering up and down all onto one piece of film. So sometimes something goes wrong. You've also been doing this for maybe 2 hours and you miss something. So you kind of like, I will kind of rewrite notes as I'm going to try to save face. A strobe maybe doesn't fire, so we turn off all the others and hit it with the one side that didn't go off again. Like all these things come up, right? Because I'm not a computer. So you can kind of plan, the extent that is planned is just virtually impossible to execute to the, perfection of what it is. In the thought process before actually physicalizing what it means to actually try to make that image.
So like I think this is what you were just saying a minute ago, that there's room between the plan and the result for, something accidental or surprising to happen. Is that about right?
Yeah. I mean, things happen constantly, especially with that many steps involved in something, problems happen. But again, we're talking about one specific project. So like where this was born from was like a very experimental approach where I was trying all kinds of things. And so that's something I go back to all the time, and whether or not those end up as works. So in terms of this was like a very specific project that just sort of got deeper and deeper over years, and I felt compelled to return to because it just kept begging to have more thought put into it. It's hard to generalize, right? Because we're talking about, is it my entire practice, or are we speaking about this one specific body of work?
That thing that you just said about feeling compelled to come back to it, and then taking that in the context of the work being a sort of problem-solving exercise. You've been coming back to this series for quite a long time. Do you feel like you're sort of coming closer to the problem being answered?
In terms of the color mixing, I think I am happy with where that's at. So I think at some point when I have some greater distance from it, I'll go back to it again and go back to sort of challenging the compositional aspects again into a more free form. Because when I look at those now, I'm like, wow, if I would have known then what I know now about color, and even how to trick exposures, as, you know, it's sort of a strategy game to get that information onto a piece of film. There's, you know, rife possibility of a really different looking images out of that end of it.
I think it's interesting to compare the earlier works and the newer ones, in that one thing that does strike me about the earlier works is that it's easier to tell with the earlier ones that you're looking at a multiple exposure, whereas with the newer ones, if you didn't know what the process was, it might not be obvious that that's what's happening. I'm not exactly sure that, I mean, that's not a question, but it is something that strikes me really interesting about that, and whether that's interesting to you too, I don't know.
Well, and part of that is just, I was newer at it. I suspect if I went back to the like compositionally open versions again, they would appear a little more solid, I guess, like a little less obvious. And this also comes back to me being able to like sort of utilize the full potential of the film now, which I was completely missing when I first started working with the process.
So one thing that I'm sort of interested in is sort of just with anybody is sort of the difference between how the artist engages with the work versus how the audience does. And I feel like there's something, like, for example, there's a photographer who I spoke with a while back whose name is Chris Angman, who a lot of the work that he makes is sort of, it's very much about how photography, how photographs lie and how photographs aren't the same as reality. And
right.
A lot
I've met him.
I think his work is really interesting. And I one of the things that I find interesting about his work is that on first glance, it's not always obvious what it is that he's done. But he has these little clues throughout that if you spend enough time with it, you can kind of get certain things about it that aren't immediately obvious. I feel like there's a similar thing with your work, where there are layers to the process that are not immediately obvious when you see the final image, but that if you spend time with it, that you can sort of tease things out that provide a lot more depth to the experience. And I'm sort of curious whether that is an experience that you're consciously trying to create for the viewer, or whether that's such something, whether your engagement with it isn't so much about creating the experience for the viewer, and it's more about something else.
No, I mean, an analogy I keep going back to, especially recently, is, well, I've said elements of this in the past. No one else could ever have my relationship with these. It would be virtually impossible. And so there's like no expectation on the audience that they would ever have even like a portion of sort of what for me has gone into them. There would be no way for that to happen. But I think, so like when I sort of veto one or decide to edition one, there is something else where I let my own relationship with it go. And I'm after sort of a photograph that just sort of incites a a feeling, right? Like something comes back that is like maybe more akin to when I look at a painting. And I think like making music to me is a wonderful analogy for it. I don't have any musical talent. It's very mysterious for me. I can't for the life of me understand being like very good at playing an instrument and all these sorts of things, but I can experience the music and it's extremely important to me. And even down to my notes, it's almost like you're writing like this sort of symphony that is like colors that are going to go into the film, and here's this thing in the end. And so there should be able to be from the audience an experience that is sort of undefinable, but like a feeling and all these other ways in. And like, that's kind of what I want to put out there. This is my writing of music, right? And you put it out and it's there.
Yeah. I find this idea of art as an experience to be really interesting because like, I think a lot of different artists are engaging with things in a lot of different ways. Like for some artists, the art is almost like a byproduct, right? That what's important to some artists is their own experience of having made it. And then once it's made, sort of whatever happens to it afterwards is sort of inconsequential. Whereas I think for other artists, they're really sort of more focused on trying to create a specific experience for the audience, and so the process of creating the work is kind of, it's sort of oriented towards creating that experience for someone else. I think for my own work, for example, is like a lot of the things that I do have to do with trying to get people to see, trying to create an opportunity for the audience to see things the way that I see them, whatever it might be that I'm doing in terms of subject matter. But so it's very conscious for me that I want to try and create this specific experience for the viewer, and they may or may not actually experience that thing. And the idea that they may have a totally different experience is actually cool. But I do have that in mind I'm interested in this because a lot of the things that we've talked about have to do with sort of the process side of things. But I'm interested in, whether the creation of this experience, like you're talking about with experiencing music, is something that you're intentional about, or whether it's something that you're more focused on your own experience of creating the work. You know what I mean?
Right. It's kind of both, right? Like my brain is wired in a certain way where there are things I need within my own process. And that's, those ways are kind of my gift and my curse, right? Like I have some OCD, and so there's just ways that I need to treat things to work through them. And like that is just how it is. In terms of sort of what I put out though is like, I like to kind of think I'm putting joy into the world. Like I like the idea that I'm putting something out that makes maybe people happy. Like if there's a sort of base feeling of the experience, like, cause there's not really a specific one, but I'm not trying to put things out that make anyone feel bad. I can tell you that, like there is, to me, the best work is a photograph that like, I didn't really even know that could be a photograph yet. So it's sort of filled with a sort of sense of wonder and awe. And like, it's through this medium that is supposed to like represent our experience of reality. And so for me, I get really excited when I can use that medium to put something out that follows all of the most like intense rules or parameters of that medium, but instead it's sort of found something that is outside of our experience and that points to sort of other things and through the abstract. And to me, that's kind of like a hopeful idea. And like in that vein, if that was what I was inciting in others, would be like a beautiful kind of symbiotic thing, but I don't put too much pressure. Once they've left the studio, they've left.
Yeah. It is sort of, relying too much on the audience to find meaning in the work I feel like that is putting a lot of pressure on the work.
Yeah, I'm happy if people think they're cool.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, you know, that's fine.
Yeah. It's interesting, like hearing you talk about, you know, the work making people happy, or like thinking that it's cool. One thing for me is that the images for me are very beautiful. It's something that, like, immediately, just because of the simplicity of form and the boldness of color and the way the colors are arranged with each other, the first response is, I don't know if I could say purely aesthetic, but like they are just so beautiful. And I always wonder, and this is true in any art form, but it's especially true for me with photography, like what beauty does in the work, you know, like what does it enable in the work for it to be beautiful? Because not all photography is beautiful. And in a lot of photography, visual arts, but especially photography, like the impact comes from the ways that it is ugly or upsetting.
Mm-hmm.
And there's, I think, value in that. But I guess I'm interested to sort of know, like, for you, is it important that your work be beautiful? And if so, then how does the beauty function in the work for you?
Well, I mean, it's complicated because it depends what you're defining as beautiful and what you're defining as beautiful in photography. My relationship with the medium is I respond to technical parameters, point blank. I shed real tears the first time I saw a daguerreotype that wasn't in a glass vitrine and it was in good condition. I was able to tilt it around because the play of light off of them really affects how they look. I walk into a museum and am like nearly nose touching a print to look at the grain, or like, you know, I get very upset when things are digitally over sharpened. So for me, like, and most people aren't going to have that relationship. And is that beauty? I don't know. So it depends where you're taking that from. I watched all like 11 hours or whatever it was of the Civil War documentary, Ken Burns, because it's so many photographs. And I was just so in awe about how there's like, when you have like the battles, there's almost none existing because of course film was very, very slow at that time and it's all like glass plates. And so it would just be like these huge chunks of grain and like you could maybe make out like a hill and it's supposed to be some like battle scene. And then contrasted with these like such dense, full of silver, like incredibly rich portraits of the soldiers that have been done when they can stay still. So it depends on what in a photograph you call beauty. I mean, my photographs don't fall into this sort of having the easily recognizable or like reality associative subject. So that part becomes removed. So you end up more with color, or if I'm working in black and white, back to sorts of these sort of technical things. Maybe more along painting lines. Yeah. Assumptions.
It is sort of a difficult question to nail down. It seems like a question for a philosopher, really, like what does beautiful mean? And I am not trained to be a philosopher. But, you know, when I think about this, like one person that comes to mind for me is Bruce Gilden, right? And people have a lot of opinions about Bruce Gilden's work that I don't know that I necessarily...
I don't know that I actually know this work.
Oh. Okay.
Should I be embarrassed?
You know, he, I think he's a magnum photographer. A lot of his work is street photography. And in particular, his especially his somewhat recent work is that, you know, he gets really close up to people in the street and like takes flash photographs of them. Sort of, he's got a very confrontational shooting style that I find very off-putting. And I find his photographs kind of off-putting as well. To me, they seem a little mean-spirited. But, you know, one thing I can't discount about his work is that although he acknowledges that other people find them grotesque, he's been very consistent in maintaining that he thinks these people are beautiful, which I just find such an interesting thing. I think that the average viewer is not going to look at a close-up portrait of a weird-looking person with, like, you know, their veins showing through their skin and like their eyeballs washed out because of the flash and just really unflattering light, and think, gosh, that's beautiful. They may find it interesting. They may have some kind of aesthetic experience with it, but beautiful isn't the word that I think the average viewer is going to find. But he's always very insistent. These people are beautiful to me. And I don't know. There's something about the idea. To me, Bruce Gilden's work is it's kind of shocking. And that's part of what makes it memorable and kind of what I don't like about it. But what that creates for the audience is a pretty visceral experience in one way or another. And again, I don't know if that's important to him, like what the audience is going to get out of it. But this idea that whatever beauty means, it is a thing that people feel, right? That everybody seems to be able to identify, that is beautiful to me. That's interesting to me. You know what I mean?
Right.
That wasn't really a good question. I'm sorry.
Well, it would help if I was familiar with the work.
Sure. Yeah.
But I mean, if we're talking pictures of people in any respect, that presents a whole host of other problems. Is the person conventionally attractive? Like we all have the whole fashion and beauty industry that of course uses photography and is therefore like loads any picture with those sorts of bad standards and things like that.
Mm.
But perhaps I don't know his work because by the sounds of it, I probably would not be a fan.
Yeah, maybe. There's sort of one more thing that I wanted to sort of touch on a little bit, and we'll see where this gets. It's just going to be maybe a little bit of a prosaic question, but I'm hoping that it will maybe bring us somewhere interesting. And that is, so there was an interview that you did a long time ago. This was in like 2011. But this is a thing that I've seen you say in a few different interviews over the years, that you have sort of accepted that people find your work or consider it to be abstract, but that you reject that it's non-representational. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that because I thought that was an interesting thing. I don't know if everybody who is listening really even knows what the difference between the two is, but I kind of wanted to tease out a little bit about why that's an important distinction for you.
It's not an important distinction for me. It's just I simply don't think they're abstract in that sense. I mean, we're sort of nitpicking, right? Like, what is abstract? Like, abstract, I guess in pure definition, is like having no representational adherences, right? Mm-hmm. But photography can do nothing but represent. You know, I said once, I was proud of this quote. Let me see. How did that go? Something to the effect of, my photography only contains the same abstraction that is present in all photographs. It just allows it, like pushes it to the surface or to become the sort of subject. I mean, a photograph is a frozen moment in time. That's an abstraction, right?
Sure.
So, yeah. I mean, my photographs are pictures of boxes. I am recording wavelengths of photons onto a substrate. It is, it's representative of the information that's been allowed to enter the lens. Yeah. The machine, the camera, has been engineered to sort of increasingly have its own brain that functions to give us back something that is akin to our experience of reality. And because I am not asking that of the medium, I have sort of broken it apart and am asking it to show me other things that I have no expectation that they're going to mimic what I'm seeing. In fact, I would prefer that they don't, but it's still using the same tool. And what the camera does is it represents the information that it's allowed to sort of access, right? So how is that abstract?
I guess what was sort of striking to me and what that interview question response was making me think about is this tension between, what you're saying that like, because in a lot of ways your photographs are very straight, right? To the extent that a photograph can be considered straight ever, which they probably shouldn't be. But
yeah, I would agree there.
But then also because the final image is something that doesn't exist in the world, right? It's only something that exists in the image itself, that sort of separates it from being a document, right? So that tension between it is representing something that was in front of the lens, but it is also representing something that doesn't exist at all. That tension there is very intriguing to me,
Well, it doesn't not exist at all. It doesn't exist in our time-space continuum or within our neural processing. How is many moments of time together any more abstract than a frozen moment of time?
Yeah, I guess that's a good point.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just, we're just so attached to our thing. But in terms of the medium, I don't know that it is any more abstract.
Yeah.
I often in my lectures will show side-by-side comparisons of a telephoto lens versus a wide angle, or video clips of a dolly zoom,
mm-hmm.
which is so great to just show how even a different lens length, the projection drastically shifts reality. But when we approach any one of those images, simply neutralize it, that's how it is. But if you look at the same scene side by side, and one's been taken with a 17 millimeter lens and one's been taken with a 300 millimeter lens, it condenses space differently. It completely changes all of the relationships of where things exist. Vastly different images of the same thing, but because everything is familiar to us still in a sort of picture of whatever in the world, then we just sort of ignore these facts. That actually what we are seeing is a projection through an optic that has taken the light and, dictated the sort of parameters of that image.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess what makes it feel, and I guess I have to admit that my own thinking is not always completely complex about these things, but because maybe non-representational, or maybe saying it doesn't represent something that exists in the world is too loose, because as you say, I like that idea. What's more abstract about a collection of moments as opposed to just one frozen moment? But because it's so different from how we experience the universe, I mean, there's a familiarity to it, but it also feels foreign in a way, right? That, I don't know, it's interesting to me.
But that's the metaphysical part, right? Because our experience of the universe isn't how it is. It's a very, very limited slice that is based on our sensitivity to collect information, which is, of course, what this whole color mixing project is based on, the additive system of color. That's how we have any color reproduction, whether it's your computer monitor or a photograph, comes originally from us first starting to understand how human color vision works. Red, green, and blue being the primaries of it. Those are our cones and rods and our sensitivities to light, which then we neural process into this sort of color vision of the world. But there is plenty of information that we're simply not accessing, whether it's outside of what we call visible light, and it's all there. So maybe they're hyper real.
Yeah.
I
like that. I also was thinking, too, even how we experience time, at least there's some people that think that the way that we experience time is more an artifact of how our brain stores information than anything else. And
it actually totally is. I had a drink once with a neuroscientist, and he told me so many good stories about time perception and the brain. And most of these things, there was one very rare abnormality caused by having a brain lesion in a very specific part of your brain where you can no longer experience fluid time. I forget what it's specifically called, but the people who have it experience time as slices, one after another. But everything else with their vision system is normal. So, I mean, that alone, does that not point to that what we're experiencing as time is more neurological than it is actual?
Yeah. I wonder too, if you had a butterfly, or I forget what those shrimp are called, a rainbow shrimp or something like that have a whole
49.
bunch of, different color receptors, what if they were capable of communicating with us, what they might say that these pictures look like.
Right. Well, this simpler version, birds and bees don't really see red, but they see into ultraviolet. So they have a completely different color wheel than we do. And flowers are filled with sort of patterns and information that we don't see, which we can see an interpretation of because we can easily photograph UV information.
Right.
So through the camera, we can actually see. So one of my favorite, because to us it is so boring, is the dandelion, which looks to be like this very perfect uniform yellow to us, where if you photograph it for its ultraviolet information, it actually has what comes off as dark if you're photographing UV information in black and white, kind of like dark targeted in the center. So who knows what color that is, but whatever it is, the bees are seeing it.
It's pretty cool. It's a little wild. It's a little unsettling sometimes to think about that difference between perception and reality, but I don't know. Sometimes it freaks me out.
See, I think it's awesome. If this was it, that to me would be depressing. Because, you know.
Yeah. Well, why don't we take a quick little break and then we'll come back and do the second segment.
Okay, that sounds good.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guest to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Okay, so that's like a loaded question. I'm not really sure, but I guess I am all consumed right now with sort of some like sweeping lifestyle changes. And so I guess because we're in this weird world situation, what they amount to is I have managed to find a real kind of positive out of this pandemic, which I think is maybe a spin that's needed. Maybe. For me, it's been invaluable. And of course, this without a doubt speaks to a huge amount of privilege that I've been able to turn it into that. But yeah, I actually feel like lockdown so far for me has been split into two very distinctive sections. The first really negative, and then now into something that I don't think ever would have happened were we not in this situation.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Like, obviously I can't speak for you, but I can certainly speak for myself that I certainly have a lot of privilege in many ways. And being able to look on the bright side of things is certainly enabled by having privilege. But I think that, you know, throughout history, we always see in times of crisis and trauma that the way people respond to things, it's something many people are able to find some bright side, some like hidden strength or new perspective that winds up being useful afterwards. And it doesn't, it's not to say that we think that it was a good thing that the crisis happened or a good thing that we were traumatized, but that,
I am not saying it is a good thing that this crisis has happened.
No.
I assure you of that.
No, but that it is, you know, that we are able to find some positive thing, even if it's a small thing, it could still be a valuable thing, you know?
Yeah, incredibly valuable for me. So I think the lockdown for me started very, very badly. I'd been traveling on what was supposed to be like, I really outdid myself, like on hotel quality, like shishi little luxe vacation, because I was supposed to go into a very, very intensive period of production. I had a museum show that was supposed to open late fall that I had not quite as much lead up time as I would have liked to get into it, and was betting my last series of shows. So it was still in the realm of certainly doable, but I was sort of gone and mentally preparing to put in a kind of 6-month work schedule like I have never known. And that, of course, all completely fell apart. And the vacation that I spent too much money on was just altogether very stressful because I was watching this unfold and boarding flights, and kind of it ended in New York, like at absolute peak. Like I left the night before they fully shut down. So, you know, the CVS there looked like a war zone. I couldn't really leave my hotel by the time I got there. It was not great. And then mandatory quarantine when I got back, having had been in New York. And then, of course, shut down here. So no lab. I couldn't work. Eventually, museum show has been well postponed. Not even sure until when. And so I ended up, well, I was very stressed because that was an important show. It was supposed to travel, and it was sort of not just that show. We were going to be attempting to pitch it to other institutions. It was kind of like the basis for what would have been my next 3 or 5 years kind of built upon going into a new body of work. And I suddenly had no deadlines, no ability to work, and being single right now, just also very much like not really many people to talk to. It became very clear pretty quickly that I had never really realized, but a large majority of my like need to socialize was happening with bartenders. Like I had all my locals on the way home from the studio, and I was kind of had my Norm Cheers thing going. So yeah, I kind of got very, very, very depressed, and depression is something I've dealt with, my whole adult life since I was a teenager, certainly, and had really, I think I hadn't totally realized how bad, but it had become much worse over the last couple of years. And I've always self-medicated, so I'd been drinking. I've always drank a lot, but the last few years maybe more so, and it had maybe hit a point where it was no longer functional to the extent that it used to be, certainly since turning 40. And then I think when all of my work got canceled and I hadn't spoke to anyone for like 12 days or something, things just really kind of dove dark, and I kind of just chain smoked and drank. I tried to work digitally a bit, which really upset me because I hate it. The things that I want to do, like the way I want to push light even. So this would have been on other things, but I was trying to shoot, and just, I'm so used to film and how it responds. And I was just getting like moire patterns. It doesn't respond in the same way. I'd want to do all this stuff with like, shiny shit, metals and paints and things. And of course, digitally reacts really, it's maybe the most unpleasant of materials that you could photograph is anything reflective in terms of how digital responds. And yet, so I was having that just really set me a bit off. And I had bought a medium format digital camera, kind of thinking that at some point there were projects I would be doing this way. So yeah, things got very dark. And then I had a birthday, and I kind of decided I would cut down drinking, and that went very bad, like worse than just drinking all the time, because I think I would go maybe longer than normal without a drink, and then all kinds of other things would surface that I was just medicating away. So now we have come to a point, I'm at almost 2 months, and I've quit drinking entirely for the time being, and it's been a little bit revelatory, I have to say. So things sort of, it's not been easy, but this has brought about, I feel like I am kind of dealing with just a host of things that were very needed to be dealt with. And I'd been sort of shoving down with a lot of booze for a really long time.
I think, I feel like I have seen a lot, just even via social media, that moving into the summer, I've seen a lot of people talking about new sobriety and how that has come about, and how specifically that this time is something that seemed to necessitate that. Like, I feel like there is often, when it comes to addictive behavior or, self-medicating, that people need to have some kind of jolt in order to bring into relief the behavior that's causing themselves a problem. and that the pandemic and the sort of extremity of experience that we're all living through right now has provided that for a lot of people. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's not just the jolt. So this is the privilege, because I don't have to go back to a job. I am my own boss, and something I needed to do for a long time was take a real time away for the work to come up with a new project and to think it through properly. And that's something like I almost should have wrote my Guggenheim saying like, I just need a year of like no deadlines. But you know, you never do that because you have these opportunities come up. And so when I kind of hit bottom because I doubled down so hard, like I was just cracking a bottle of wine at, 11 a.m. And I'll spare you the details, but things got very, very, very dark. And I've never not had a deadline in my adult life. So when I got really lucky, and the sort of rock bottom, like the sort of black hole became a door, and I kind of saw like, what a window. And this is like, when else could it be this easy? There's like no gallery dinners. There's no art openings. There's none of that stress. So that aspect is completely gone. There are no bars, which was how I was like, I had sort of isolated myself, and it was just like work. And that was sort of how I was getting fulfilled for like social interactions with people outside of, assistants or my studio manager. And so like that stuff was suddenly gone. And for me, when I stopped drinking, what I get back is a lot of like neurological stuff. So now I'm taking an opportunity to look into that, and with a psychiatrist who does neurological evaluations, and like being evaluated for ADHD, possible like autism spectrum, OCD, because there's definitely, when I'm not quieting it, things in my mind. And I used to kind of think I needed like drinking was part of my working process, but it's actually, I was like doing stuff. And what came out when I felt good about my work, that is like kind of the blessing and the curse in terms of how my brain works, was in spite of that. And so for the first like 3 weeks, I was like full-time job walking. I would just leave the house in the morning, music, and like 6-7 hours walking, which is the only thing that kind of quiets the flood of like brain that comes back as soon as I'm not dulling it down. And what an opportunity to be able to do that and like not have the stress that I'm avoiding the work for the deadline, for this, for that. And like slowly through that, I'm coming back to where all these things came from in the first place, like how my thinking works. And like, I think I obviously would have done something for the museum, and it would have been fine because I have, for 20 years done nothing but think about photography, and I have the technical chops. But I don't think I was in a position where I had the capacities I had 18 years ago when I got myself first on the sort of tracks that became the work that I was known for. I think my capacities had been like beaten down to kind of get back to that place again. So I was able to kind of look at this as almost work. It's like, your job right now is actually to go for a 5-hour walk and like think through these things.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like so many of us, and even surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, a lot of artists sort of have this impression that, like, for example, if I take care of my mental health, right? Like if I see a therapist or I take medication that I need, that's going to get in the way of me being able to be creative, that in some way we need to suffer, or that we need to be in extremity in order to produce creative work. When really, for a lot of people, what we end up finding out is that working through these things ends up being more generative than suppressive. And I find that really fascinating, Yeah,
because I think that is the myth, like we all read too much Bukowski when we were 19 or whatever, I think there's like such a romantic notion, and it's been in, musicians and artists, and you do kind of buy into that, I think. I mean, I love wine as well. Like I love drinking, But it was not serving me, at least not the relationship I had developed with it. And I think I had totally was having no concept of how much I was drinking to sort of dull down a lot of stuff. And yeah, it was a real moment where I realized I couldn't make good new work in the conditions I had come to find myself living.
Yeah. And I think another thing too that sort of came up for me in what you were saying is how, this time, again, like neither of us wants to say that this is a good thing. I mean, obviously a lot of people are really struggling right now, and certainly we wouldn't want to minimize that. But I think that there is something that is happening for many people where we are sort of reevaluating sort of our position in the world, and in particular with the economic world. That, I mean, and, Canada is somewhat different, but pretty similar in a lot of ways to the United States, less completely cutthroat and you're completely on your own, maybe, than we are, certainly less fascist than we seem to be getting. But there is still, a strong sort of capitalist drive that happens in Canada as well as in the United States. And hearing you talk about the stress you were feeling to produce, I mean, even for someone like you, who you have good representation and your galleries can handle a lot of the business side and promotion side for you, but still you would feel a lot of pressure to be part of that capitalist machine, right? And having the opportunity to reevaluate that, it does seem like an upside. And I don't want to say a blessing, because I feel like that minimizes the downsides and the horrible negatives that so many people are experiencing. But there is something valuable about being able to take a different perspective on that. You know what I mean?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, it would have never occurred to me to write a grant to essentially do nothing, to like walk all day, because that's the time I need to sort of like reacquaint myself with what the project maybe is, or what I want to be making, or like, I almost call it find it, because it's sort of out there, right? Because we're so conditioned that things need to have like measurable outcomes and like, these sort of concrete examples of that you're producing, essentially. But I had many years before I had any art career to mull these things over, is where sort of the main bodies of work I made came from in the first place. And so it's absurd, actually, to think that I could get into a new project again without having some of this like really just free-flowing kind of time to work through it.
Yeah, it is interesting how, I think we all kind of go through this as people engaged in creative work, where, like, I remember reading Sally Mann's autobiography a while ago. This was, probably, 5, 6, 7 years ago, something like that. And there's a lot of things about that autobiography that are a little bit problematic, or maybe extremely problematic, but the way that she talked about her engagement with her creative practice was really fascinating to me, because there was she described this anxiety that I don't know if you ever feel, but I know I have felt at times, where, when she's going into a new body of work, when she's starting a new body of work, there's this anxiety of even though I've done this for a long time and it's always worked out before, I'm not sure if it's going to work out this time. Like I don't know if I'll ever have another good idea again. And I feel like there is this thing that happens. What brought this to mind when you were talking just now is that when we get used to working in a certain mode and in a certain, set of parameters and constraints for a really long time, as you've done with your ongoing series. And certainly this has been true for me. I also work on long-term series, and my series often go 6, 8 years, something like that, where you get used to working on something in a certain way. And then when it comes time to, go in a new direction, that by the time I've gotten there, I've sort of forgotten how I ever started anything else before. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and one thing that for me that came up is like how much that project actually relates to just some of the ways that my brain seems to be wired. And so something that occurred to me is that a new direction can actually still really follow a lot of that. And I also kind of solved my digital problem is what can I do with that? And so I've started to really mull over ideas about animation that would essentially be extensions in a way of that project, in that I'm thinking about, well, what if the animation is, rather than like an object moving per se, but color information is shifting and these sorts of things. And could I sort of come up with formulas or codes and then sort of circling that back into the ideas of like music, or like how, could you structure something like that, or maybe like how a distortion pedal functions or things like that.
Yeah. I often, sort of going back to that idea, the grocery store metaphor that we were talking about in the first part, like, I think that for me, it can be so overwhelming at the beginning of a project because there are so many possibilities and I don't know what they are yet. For me, the way I end up working is that I almost have to back into a project, like, because of the way that I shoot is very observational, and it's just sort of me reacting to things that I always, every time it has just happened, when I don't realize I'm working on something until I've been working on it sort of unconsciously or subconsciously for a couple of years. And then I realize, oh, I have a project. I guess I have been trying to work through something.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the biggest thing, I need to think about things a lot before I do them. But the big thing is once it actually gets physicalized, because in that moment, a year of my thinking will shift in a second, because it is never the reality of doing what my brain has decided is possible is like immediately combative and has to shift all of my ideas. And they're both kind of important, but there's like, I need to know my limits of when I have thought through a problem where it is now just on a loop until it is like birthed into the physical world, and then that it will shift in an instant and become something else.
Yeah. It's pretty interesting how the mind works. And, everybody ends up having their own, like, coming to some realization of how your rhythms as a creative person are it's always such a personal thing and so specific to each person. I feel like so many people that I've talked to, it ends up being like, you just have to kind of realize and trust that like what your rhythms are, because they're not going to be the same as anybody else.
Right. Yeah.
So, okay, there's one question that I like to end with, and that is if there's a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Well, one of the books I got recently, I cannot stop looking at the Emma Kuntz stuff. I got a book called World Receivers, and it's Hilma F. Klint and Emma Kuntz and someone else. I got it really recently, but I've only looked at her stuff. It makes so much sense. And I think, do you know these? They're on graph paper and they're like very OCD drawings.
I don't.
Oh, they're great. Am I saying her name right now? I'm like freaking out. At any rate, they're kind of playing into some of the ways I'm seeing things animate to some extent, like loosely anyway.
All right.
They're all on graph paper, very like kind of obsessive geometric drawings.
Cool. I'll have to make sure and check that out. Put a link in the show notes.
Yeah. And I have been listening to so much music. It's unbelievable. I think I kind of forgot about how important that was to me. I got my turntable fixed, which has been on a 2-year state of disrepair, and bought myself very proper walking headphones for when it's coming off MP3s. Cool. So much music. Yeah. Yeah. No, it feels good. I think, you get in these zones, and I had somehow failed to, like, I'd stripped my life of all of the things that gave me joy. I'd kind of forgot about them, and it had isolated all my joy into just the one thing, which was sort of dining and drinking. And that I had funneled everything into that, when in reality, there's like so much more. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there are links in the show notes to Jessica's work at M&B Gallery and Higher Pictures Gallery. Do check those out. Both galleries are open by appointment, and you can inquire via email if you'd like to purchase one of Jessica's prints. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me. The music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help on this episode is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you've got any questions, comments, guest suggestions, or, I don't know, you want to tell me about your favorite Golden Age Hollywood musical, you can find all of this show's contact and social media information on our website at keepthechanneleopen.com, along with transcripts, email newsletter, and show notes. And of course, if you're enjoying the show, I hope you will tell a friend, share it on social media, leave a review, all that good stuff. If you're interested in listening to some excellent and diverse fiction, you can check out my other show, Likewise Fiction, where I read outstanding short stories by authors including Rachel Lyon, Amal El-Mokhtar, J.Y. Yang, Jose Pablo Iriarte, and more. You can find that wherever podcasts can be found or at likewisefiction.com. Keep the Channel Open. We'll be back in 2 weeks, so stay tuned for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.